Hideaway from Quilter's Hideaway. This is part 3 of our binding series. Our first video went over how to calculate your binding and how to prepare it. The second video, how to sew it on your quilt and get it done. This video is all about specialty binding, whether you want to add some rickrack, maybe a little peekaboo flange, or even bind with some Cuddle or some minky. We're gonna learn how to do that today. Right here, right now, let's go. All right, first up is how to do just a traditional flange binding. What I like to do is cut a 1-inch strip of fabric for my peekaboo or my flange that's just gonna peek out of the edge. Then I cut my binding just like normal. I like a 2.5-inch strip. You sew all your strips together, and when you're about to sew it onto the quilt, that's when we're gonna talk. So remember, press that binding in half and go ahead and press your flange in half lengthways too. Okay, once you get your binding flange and binding pressed and prepared, you're ready to sew it onto your quilt. So this flower is the top or the front of my quilt, and then the back is just a tan or cream color. So I'm going to lay my flange raw edge facing out. So this is how it opens with that fold. So raw edge facing out, I'm going to line it up on the edge here. And then I'm going to apply my binding piece just over that, and I line everything up on this edge. All right, now it's time to sew it on. Your corners and binding or joining together at the end is done exactly the same as if you didn't have the flange. You just use both pieces together as you go. Let's head to the machine and sew it on. Okay, quilt top faces up, just as you would regular binding. And I went ahead and pinned it on because I don't want to lose that flange that's just under my machine. So everything's folded, lined up on the edge correctly, and I'm just going to sew my 1/4-inch seam as if I were sewing on my binding. You would leave a tail at the middle. I'm just going to sew on an edge so we can see what it'll look like. You would leave that 10-inch tail in the middle so you can join up your seams. So here I'm coming up onto a corner, so we'll go ahead and do a corner together. Sew a 1/4 inch from that corner. You can either pick up your presser foot or sew off at an angle. Open up that strip or those strips together just like this, and then push them over the direction you're about to sew, as we learned in video 1 of our series here. Stick it back under that machine, a 1/4 inch in, and start sewing. All right, so once you sew it just like this, all you have to do is press it out, and you're ready to flip it around the back of your quilt and sew it down. You can either sew it down by hand or using a machine. That is totally up to you, but that's kind of the finished look. Now, if you want a smaller flange, you could do maybe 3/4 inch here, or take a bigger bite when you sew it on. I really like to have a little bit bigger of a flange so I can truly see my peekaboo all the way through. But there you have it for the real flange. I'm trying to press it around so you can see just like that. Now I would flip it to the back and either hand sew it down, or you could machine sew it, totally up to you. So the back would just be the solid color and the front would be where you have the peekaboo. Here is what it looks like with the real flange. Now remember, I did a 1-inch flange and then I cut my binding normal at 2.5 inches. I pressed them and I sewed a 1/4 inch in all the way around my quilt, and that gave me the real flange look. Now, what if you want the real flange look without cutting 2 strips and messing with the 2 strips as you sew? Well, you can do the faux flange look, which also works great if you're going to machine sew the binding on both sides. So here's how to do that. Grab your flange fabric and your binding fabric. I want a peekaboo of yellow and binding in blue. My peekaboo fabric for the faux flange look, 1 3/4. So cut that strip at 1 3/4 inch On my reel or my binding strip, I'm gonna cut it at 1.5. Hang tight, let's get those cut. Okay, I have cut my flange at 1 3/4, my binding at 1.5. I'm going to sew these two together all the way lengthways and then press towards the smaller piece or the binding piece. In my case, it's this solid blue. So press towards the piece that you do not want to have the peekaboo from. All right, so we've gotten it sewn. Remember, I sewed my binding strip, which is the blue, onto the flange strip, which is the yellow. I'm going to now head to the iron and press towards my binding or towards this blue, this smaller strip. Here we go. Now remember, you could sew all of your strip pairs together and then sew all of the strips together then, or sew all of your small strips together, all of your large strips together, and then sew this strip set, the blue-yellow strip set. I just have a little piece to be able to show you on camera, but lots of different ways to do this. Basically, you just need enough binding prepared for the quilt that'll go all the way around. Once I have this sewn, I'm going to press it just like normal, wrong sides to wrong sides, and I'll start to see that tiny flange peek out here. All right, let's head to the quilt. Here we are back at the quilt, and I have my binding with that faux flange right here. So one side, I did not press very well. So one side is completely yellow, which is my flange color, and one side has my binding color, which is this blue, and then that flange peeking out, right? Okay, here's the deal. We're gonna sew this onto the back side of my quilt. So it's a little backwards from what we did earlier. So the back side of my quilt is this taupe color. When we do this faux flange binding, it's a little different. So my quilt is right side down, or the back of my quilt is this taupey color, and I have my binding prepared right here, just like this. So this blue and yellow flange is what I want to be on the front of my quilt, all right? So I'm gonna lay the binding color face down on the back of my quilt. So when I flip it over and I flip it to the front, I'm gonna see that flange. So raw edge to raw edge, just like shown, and the flange fabric is all facing up, so my binding fabric is facing down. Let's head to the machine and get this sewn on. Okay, so just as a recap, I'm sewing the faux flange binding onto the wrong side or the back side of my quilt. It's all been pressed just like our regular binding, and I'm going to start sewing. I leave a tail at the front and at the end so I can line up my seam or line up my tails and sew them together like in video 2. You would treat the corners just like if it was a regular quilt, how you open it and then close it. So how you would open it and then flip it and start sewing right back down, just like you would if you were at any kind of corner. So that is the nice thing about a faux flange, is you treat it like one strip. All right, so you sew it on, and then I start to flip it. So I flip it towards the front of my quilt, just like this. Now the reason that it's really nice for machine binding is I'm going to flip it over, put it back under my machine, and then I can sew it on, hiding my seam in that pretend flange or that faux flange seam from earlier. So I just sew right along that faux flange, trying to stay in that ditch. So then you get something that looks a lot like this, and it's pretty easy or simple. You might have your seam on the back, but if you use a bobbin, that'll blend in. You really wouldn't know, and the flange still kind of flaps just like that. So it gives you a spot to hide that seam, which is perfect. Two more pretty simple methods of binding or adding a specialty binding are using rickrack in place of a flange and binding with minky or Cuddle fabric, so the fuzzy stuff. All right, to add that rickrack, all you're gonna do is you're going to take your quilt with your binding prepared. You'll lay that rickrack in as if it were the flange, and then you lay your binding on top. You sew your strip, and when you flip it over, you have a little rickrack sticking out, and it's super cute. So in place of the flange, you would see rickrack. The other thing is, with Cuddle fabric, I like to cut my strip at 2 inches. So 2 inches here, and I do a 1/2 inch seam. So I have a strip cut at 2 inches. I'm gonna head to the machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam to get it attached to the quilt, and then I'll show you how to finish that off as well. All right, for this one, we're gonna do a 1/2 inch seam. So if you'll notice, I just have my 2 inch strip of minky right sides down towards the front of the quilt. On this one, you can either do it on the front of the quilt or the back of the quilt. Practice what you like. Some people like to do it on the front. Some people prefer to do it on the back. All right, once you have it stitched down on the front or the back, whichever direction you want, you're going to flip it to the back or opposite direction of what you had it. Here's where I like the 1/2 inch seam. So I'm gonna line up the raw edge of my minky right on or a little beyond the seam line from sewing on the minky or the binding. So right in here, this 1/2 inch seam, that's where I'm gonna line up my fabric to go all the way down. Now I cut a 2 inch strip of fabric for this binding. You could always cut it a little smaller, maybe 1.5. You'd have a lot less play on that edge. So that's just a preference thing. And then make sure that you put a sewing machine foot on your machine that can do a zigzag so you have the wider window. Set your machine for the zigzag and go to town. So I'm just lining up the edge of my minky fabric on the edge or on the seam from sewing the binding on the front side. And then I stitch it down. After a couple washes, you won't see your seam. And you'll be set. All right, so here it is, just like that. So you can see the hairs a little bit, but as you wash minky, that'll kind of blend in, and then same thing on the back, it's right along the edge, but it'll blend in over time. So there's how to do minky. All right, that is several specialty binding techniques that you can use to step up your binding game just a little bit more. Whether you choose to have a real flange, remember I cut my flange at 1 inch for this project, which gives you a pretty large flange. You can cut it down a little bit. So whether you do a real flange or a faux flange size for this, 1.5 on your binding strip, 1 3/4 inch strip for your flange size. That works great if your machine sewing your binding on both sides, or use a real flange if you want to flip it over and hand sew on the back. Other things are you could add rickrack as a flange. So all you do for rickrack is you cut your 2.5 inch binding strip or whatever size you like to bind with, add that rickrack in just like I did with the regular flange or the first step that we did. You can also bind with any type of minky or Cuddle fabric. Remember, that doesn't fray, so you can do a raw edge. I like to cut my strip at 2 inch to give a little give on the edge, then I sew it on with a 1/2 inch seam. You can always cut that minky strip at 1.5 inches if you want it a little tighter to your quilt. All right, that finishes up our specialty binding series. Remember, any of these techniques take practice. Today, I showed you how to quickly attach them. If I'm going to do it on a quilt for myself, I might take a little time and really try to perfect those seams. So don't think that you're gonna get it in the first 2 seconds of trying. If you enjoyed watching all of these specialty binding techniques, or if you have your own, let me know in the comments below and give the video a thumbs up. We can't wait to see you next time, so hit that bell so you get notified on our next video. See you at the machine.